By the late 19th century, the peninsula of Italy was brought under one flag, unifying the regions into what we now know as Italy. Politically, the country was unified, but the people were not. Decades of internal strife had left widespread poverty. Diseases and natural disasters swept through the new nation, but the nascent government lacked the necessary money and tools to bring aid to the people. Between 1880 and 1920, the economic crisis following Italy's unification worsened and political and social unrest intensified. At the same time, transatlantic transportation became more affordable, and news of American prosperity came to Italy through returning immigrants and U.S. recruiters.
Grandpa, what was it like coming to America?
Well, I came here in 1907. It was about a year after I arrived in America from San Severo that I met your godmother. I remember worrying about coming to America, but knew there was a big community of Italians here, and starting out on Federal Hill made that transition a lot easier. I was very lucky that my family had connections with friends already on Providence. Many of us took the traditions from the old country with us. This made the adjusting easier. Being in a neighborhood like Federal Hill that was filled with Italians who spoke the same language, ate the same foods, had the same fiesta, like the celebration of San Giuseppe Day, made me feel more at home in my new country. When I came to America, I only have $7 in my pocket. I had to work in the jewelry factories and save up money to start the shoe business. I really didn't know what was in store for me, but I knew we had to try to make better life for myself. Back in Italy, my family worried about me. I've learned the family trade of repairing shoes, but with little money at the time. My parents wondered how I would survive with little money in Italy, let alone support a family. They thought that I would have an easier time making a living and starting a life here in America. I was lucky to live fairly close to the port of Napoli. I had learned from other immigrants in America talking about having to travel great distances and spend what little money they had on a hotel that left something to be desired. Many people in my position traveled to America in steerage or third class. It was the cheapest way to go. The trip to America was not easy. I had no idea what it would be like on an ocean liner, how long and challenging that trip would be. You hear stories about the voyage, but nothing prepares you for the challenges. I know people had different experiences than me based on what line they took, the ships they were on, the time of the year, and the weather. A storm in the Atlantic could cause severe sickness. I took a Faber Line ship, the SS Madonna, in the summer. I could not say for sure how many people were in steerage with me, but it was somewhere in the hundreds. We were all in one very large room. It was so cramped and there was not enough or a lot of ventilation. People got seasick. Imagine, we have all in the same room. The same place we spend our days. The same place people will sleep. And people does get sick. It was awful. I felt like I could not breathe well, and I even got sick myself. It was very rough going. So you can imagine what a relief I felt to get into port and get off the ship. Once we got to America, though, there was a long process of being checked for diseases before we could enter. Being in those close quarters, disease could spread quickly. Even though the Fabre line official checked us all before we entered the ship, we had to be checked again more thoroughly upon arrival. As steerage passengers, we were checked inside Ellis Island. The first-class passengers on ships, I heard, were able to stay in their cabins, and the official came to see them. That must have been nice. Lines to get inspected at Ellis Island were long, and many of us still had to travel to our final destination by train. Everyone back home had heard of the dreaded eye man who would perform a painful test to check for trachoma, which was highly contagious. That was the hardest part of the inspection process. Luckily, I was given the green light and I was my way to Providence.
An estimated 4 million Italians immigrated to the United States, with the majority coming from impoverished southern Italian regions like Sicily, Calabria, and Abruzzo. While there are examples of Italian Americans creating large and profitable businesses in America, like Contadina Food and even the Bank of America, at the turn of the 20th century, Southern Italian immigrants were among the lowest paid workers in the United States. Many Italian immigrants, especially women and children, often found work in sweatshops and unsafe factories around New York. The infamous Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire in 1911 killed 146 workers, and nearly half of them were young Italian women. Gerardo came with a trade and thus did not fall prey to the unsafe working conditions or the padrone system. Many thousands of Italian immigrants did. The padrone were labor brokers, sometimes immigrants themselves, who recruited Italians for large employers. They acted as overseers, controlling the wages, contract, and food supply of the immigrants under their authority. Despite the system's many injustices, it continued until the middle of the 20th century. Because of the influx of young immigrants coming to America, the steamship business was booming. Steamship companies often made most of their money in the immigrant trade. Steerage travel brought in more money than the lavish first-class travelers because of the sheer number of people leaving Europe to find a better life in America. Before transatlantic travel legislation required it, some steamship companies themselves created safer and easier conditions for travelers, knowing that they could make monetary gains. In the 1850s, William Inman of the Liverpool-based Inman Line created a new steerage class that provided for better living conditions and briefer travel. By the late 19th century, separate steerage dining and sanitary facilities were common, as well as lounges and semi-private cabins. Most lines prior to 1900 did not have separate dining facilities. Steerage passengers would spend all their time below deck, eating and sleeping in the same room where many got seasick. In fact, people used to have to bring their own food for the voyage. With unpredictable weather or maintenance stops, sometimes passengers ran out of food. Albert Ballin, head of the Hamburg America line, created a one-ticket system in the early 1900s that would allow immigrants one price to get to the ship, lodging at the port in a hotel the company built to house travelers, the fare for travel, plus train transportation to their final destination. This system was largely used by middle-class immigrants. Immigrants would write home about their good experience, which increased business. His ideas and innovations would be replicated by other companies seeking to generate more business. At the time Gerardo was traveling, improvements were made, but the journey was still bleak. In 1909, the Immigration Commission's report was presented to Congress about the conditions of steerage travel to the United States. The information in the report was gathered by special agents of the Commission who traveled in steerage on board 12 different transatlantic steamers. Prior to this report, there had never been a thorough investigation of the conditions for immigrants. Conditions varied based on ship, but the goal of this report was to ensure the universal human needs for food, air, space, sleep, and privacy would be required under the law. In ships with the old type of steerage, the agents found that passengers had to bring their own towels and toilet necessities, and that sweeping was the only form of cleaning that was done. The vomit of the seasick was often left for long periods before being removed. Open deck space was limited. Sleeping compartments were where passengers had to spend most of their time. There was inadequate ventilation, there was a lack of privacy for women, and wash basins were too few. On top of all that, there was not a separate place for dining. The new type of steerage that was investigated mostly followed the plans for accommodation for second or cabin class passengers. The issue with these ships was that most of them brought in immigrants from Northern Europe, which had become a relatively small number at this time. The majority came from Southern Europe, and thus more people experienced harsher travel conditions. Competition among the steamship lines created the biggest influence on improved conditions for the immigrants.
Teresa, do you remember when we met in Calise Bakery on the hill? When I met you, I knew I had to get my acting gear. If I was going to marry you and start a family, I knew I had to save all the money I was earning from the jewelry manufacturing job. The times were tough then, but we made it through and eventually opened the shoe store in East Providence. We were lucky to find a house right behind the shop.
Why did you name the store Jerry's, if your name is Gerardo?
Well, I wanted to sound more American. We call it Jerry's Hollywood Shoes because outside of Federal Hill, with the name Gerardo, we would take a chance to lose more business to Americans that were not exactly welcoming of Italian immigrants of the time. Teresa, why don't you talk about what it was like of you coming to America?
I felt like a fish out of water. I was also new to America at the time when we first met. My father had recently passed away, and without his financial help and support, my family was struggling. My older brother was the first to come here. Once he was established in Providence, it was easier for me to come along. I traveled with the steamship Principe di Piemonte, and I was so nervous about traveling by myself for such a long time. I had never left my hometown. Luckily, there was an older woman that I became friends on the ship, and we stuck together. Remember how you had to convince my brother that you could support me and eventually our family. He was protective of me since it was my only family in the country at that time. He worried that with the prejudice in America, you might have had a hard time finding work. But you proved him wrong. Thank God you learned your trade He was thrilled when we had enough money and space to bring over my mother, Concetta, and my other sibling. But even with all my family here, life wasn't as easy as I thought it would be. Even though our son Henry was off fighting for America in World War II, our radio was confiscated because the government was worried that Italian Americans could be swayed into siding with their homeland. I am still offended. This suspicion could not be farther from the truth. Henry was a fighter pilot and flew 75 combat missions over Europe. He helped provide cover during the D-Day invasion and was even one of those daring pilots that flew under the Arch of Triumph once Paris was liberated. I was so worried about him and honestly mad that he would take such a silly risk like flying under the Arc of Triumph. But I was also extremely proud. He even earned the Distinguished Flying Cross.
As waves of Italians like Gerardo and Teresa arrived in America to begin a better life for themselves and their families, they were forced to confront prejudice and nativist hostilities. Nativism refers to the policy of protecting the interests of native-born or established inhabitants against those of immigrants. In the late 19th century, anti-immigration sentiments were sweeping the nation. The United States faced an economic depression, and many blamed immigrants for taking American jobs. During this time, racialist theories circulated in the press, using pseudo-scientific theories claiming that Mediterranean types were inherently inferior to people of Northern European heritage. Attempting to dehumanize immigrants, drawings and songs portraying them as childlike and criminal became commonplace. Anti-immigration societies sprang up around the country beginning in the 1880s, and the Ku Klux Klan saw a spike in membership. Catholic churches and charities were vandalized and burned. In the 1890s alone, more than 20 Italians were lynched. The largest single lynching in U.S. history took place in New Orleans in 1891. When the chief of police was murdered, the mayor blamed Sicilian gangsters and rounded up more than 100 Sicilian Americans. 19 of them were put on trial, but were found not guilty for lack of evidence. But before they could be freed, a mob of 10,000 people, including many of New Orleans' most prominent citizens, broke into the jail. They dragged 11 Sicilians from their cells and lynched them, including 2 men jailed on other offenses. Anti-immigration sentiment continued into the 1920s, when severe restrictions on immigration were put into place by the U.S. Congress. When this legislation passed, the great era of Italian immigration came to an end. Even before the Emergency Quota Act, legislation was passed to try to limit immigration. The General Immigration Act of 1882 levied a head tax of 50 cents, or approximately $13 today, on each immigrant and blocked the entry of idiots, lunatics, convicts, and persons likely to become a public charge. The Federal Literacy Test Act of 1917 required immigrants over the age of 16 to be able to read, quote, not less than 30 nor more than 80 words in ordinary use, unquote. It also raised the head tax to $8 or $179 today. In most years, the government made more money in head taxes than it spent on administration. Although this act attempted to limit immigration, in reality it had little effect. The Emergency Quota Act became law on May 19, 1921, and took effect on July 1st. It added 2 new features to American immigration law: numerical limits on immigration and the use of a quota system for establishing those limits. It marked the first time in American history that a numerical cap on immigration was set. The bill was so uncontroversial that it passed the U.S. Senate 78-1. The second major legislative act aimed at limiting immigration was more stringent. The National Origins Act of May 1924 put a cap on immigrants coming from Southern and Eastern Europe. The baseline for the quota was pushed back to the census of 1890 because updating to the 1920 census would have allowed for more Eastern and Southern Europeans to immigrate. For the first time, visas and photographs were required, and with a $9 charge for the visa and the increase of the head tax to $9, immigrants now had to pay $18 to enter. Adjusted for inflation, this would equal roughly $271 today. With these increased restrictions, the Faber line sought to diversify and include more eligible immigrants. In 1923, it began service eastward in the Mediterranean. The Providence Journal began reporting the nationality of these new immigrants. They included persecuted Armenians from Turkey, Syrian and Lebanese Christians fleeing Muslim rule, Greeks, Jews from a number of countries, and Ukrainians and Romanians leaving the Black Sea area. Because of the tightening laws on immigration to the United States, the Italian government restricted the carrying of Italian immigrants solely to Italian ships. This left lines like Cunard, Anchor, and White Star to combine their separate offices in order to offset the loss in immigration revenue from third-class passage. Under pressure, the American and British governments exempted taxes on profits from the shipping lines in both countries. When Congress changed the quota system to reflect populations from the 1890 census, it slightly increased the number of immigrants from the British Isles. But with Cunard's business in the immigrant trade permanently weakened, the line diversified their operations and included reduced third-class fares with increased amenities for tourist travel. The Faber line also began to promote pleasure cruising as a business model to make up for the loss in immigrant trade, as a new middle class in America could now afford the luxury of international travel. This was not the end of immigration to America, but the peak of immigration via steamships had ended, and the lines looked to diversify business.